Hello everybody, my name is Agnia and we will discuss such topic as CSS Grid Layout. Here you can find some contact information and let's get it started. CSS Grid Layout is the most powerful layout system available in CSS. It is a two-dimensional system, meaning it can handle both columns and rows, unlike Flexbox, which work only in one dimension. You work with grid layout by applying CSS rules both to a parent element, which becomes the grid container, and to that element children, which become grid items. CSS has always been used to lay out our web pages, but it never done a very good job of it. First we use tables, then floats, positioning, and inline blocks. But all of these methods were essentially hacks and left out a lot of important functionality, like vertical centering, for example. Flexbox helped out, but it's only one-dimensional system. Grid is the first CSS model created specifically to solve the layout problems, with often hacking way around as long as we've been making websites. Let's talk about terminology. First will be grid container. Grid container is the element on which display grid is applied. It is a direct parent of all grid items. In this example, container is grid container if in CSS we applied rule display grid. Next will be grid item. It's the children of the grid container. Here the item element is grid item, but sub-item element inside item isn't grid item. Grid line. Grid line is the dividing line that make up the structure of the grid. Grid cell is the space between two row and two column grid lines. Grid track is the space between two grid lines. You can think of them like the columns or rows of the grid. Here is the grid track between the second and the third row grid line. Grid area is the total space surrounded by four grid lines. First, second, third, and fourth. Grid container, by setting display property, create a value display grid or display inline grid. Explicitly set a grid by creating columns and rows with the grid template columns properties and grid template rows properties. Here we can see two examples. In our first examples, we set property grid template rows for the first row and for the second row. Track size values can be any non-negative length value, like pixels, cent, etc. Because only two row track were defined, heights of items 3 and 4 are defined by the content of each other. And in other second example, we set property grid template columns. Here we can see examples of setting minimum and maximum track size. In first example, the first row track is set to have a minimal height of 100 pixels, but its maximum size of outer will allow the row track to grow it to the content is taller than 100 pixels. In our second example, we set property grid template columns, and this column track has a minimum size of outer, but its maximum size of 50% will prevent it from getting no wider than 50% of the grid container width. Now let's talk about repeating grid tracks. Define repeating grid tracks using the repeat notation. This is useful for grid with items with equal size of many items. The repeat notation accepts two arguments. The first represents the number of times the defined track should repeat, and the second is the track definition. So in this example, we repeat rows 4 times and we repeat columns 3 times, and in notation repeat we also define the size of row and the size of column. Grid gaps or gutters. The grid column gap and grid row gap properties create gutters between columns and rows. Gap size values can be not negative length value, like pixel, percent, etc. If two values are specified, the first represents grid row gap and the second grid column gap. So in the right side you can see example when we specified two properties in one line. Here you can see a list of values which you can set for these properties. If you set line item start, items are positioned at the start of the column axis. So end and center properties work at the same time. If you use align items stretch, items are stretched across the entire column axis. Also, grid tracks can be aligned relative to the grid container along the row and column axis. We talked about start and center stretch properties, and now let's talk about these three properties. Justify content space between. The remaining space is distributed between the column tracks. If you use justify content space around, the remaining space of the grid container is distributed and applied to the start and end of each column track. So in space around you can see some space here, but there are no space in space between. And the last but not least value is space evenly. The remaining space is distributed where the space between the columns are equal to the space at the start and the end of the row track. Now let's see examples of combining different CSS grid properties, because there are a lot of different information about CSS grid, but I think we talked about main properties, and now we can see how we can combine and work with them. So see, here you can see a grid with class wrapper, and now let's see CSS properties. For wrapper we set display grid and we set property display gap. Set the gaps between rows and columns. So this gap between rows and between columns is defined by that property. Also we set grid template columns and grid template rows. Grid line can generally be named whatever you like, but assigner names ending in start and end come with added benefits. They implicitly create named grid areas, which can be referenced for positioning. So here we set areas and we set their names and their size. In this line we set it for columns, and in this line we set it for rows. We in our HTML code set class for each element, and for this element we set class box A. Now let's see how we write CSS properties. We defined grid column, and it is a simpler way to write grid column start and grid column end. So this property means that it starts from call 1 start and end with call 3 start. Grid row we defined with one value because it's take only one row, and the different situation is with class B. It take one column, but it take two rows. So with the help of classes and grid column, grid row properties, we create this table. We should talk about browser support of this technology, and as of March 2017, most browsers support for CSS Grid. Here you can see version of browsers which support CSS Grid. So I think that the time to build with Grid is now. Thank you for attention.